I don't think I'm the only person who sometimes buys art materials and then they just sit on the shelf and don't get used. I certainly assume I'm not the only one. Over a year ago, I bought myself a set of watercolor pencils and I never really got around to actually doing anything with them. So today I thought it'd be fun to finally use them for the first time. Now I say for the first time, but when I first got them, the one thing I did do was I made a swatch sheet. So I drew all of my colors out so I can see what they look like. And then that's all I did. So this is very different to the usual materials I use. I'm very much used to working with color pencil, pastel pencil, or graphite. And these seem to have a very different approach to them. So I was feeling a little bit overwhelmed. I thought the best thing to do would be to watch a load of videos, do a lot of reading up on it. I read a book and I'll see if that's helped. I will say that there is more to them than I thought. I always assumed there was only one way to use watercolor pencils. That being putting pencil down on the paper and using water to activate it. So let's start there and then I'll show you some of the other things I've found out we can do. Now all I'm trying to do here is just make a nice gradient. So I'm just going to put a very small amount of pencil on the right hand side and much more on the left hand side. And then where I'm blending with the water, I want to be blending from the lighter colour to the darker colour, because if I try and blend from the dark to the light, it's just going to deepen everything down far more than I want it. So I'm just playing around with the amount of water I need. That seems to be a very important part of using these pencils. And actually, it seems like I need a little bit more than I think I'm going to. So that makes a very rough, not perfect gradient. I've got a bit of practicing to do. But let's talk about some of the other things I've found out you can do with these pencils. So you can also use these as kind of more traditional watercolors. Using a wet brush, I can take some pigment off the end of the pencil and just paint as normal. So this is putting wet paint on dry paper. I can also wet the paper and do exactly the same thing, but I can use this to make a much softer look and make kind of a wash with this colour. So it is looking a lot like kind of conventional watercolour. I can also use my piece of paper as a palette. So I'm going to here put down two different colours. I'm going to put a patch of purple, I'll put some blue on top of that. And then I can once again use this in the same way. So I can pick up that pigment off the paper and use it to paint some wiggly lines. I can also once again wet the paper and use pigment from this little patch to make a more purpley blue wash. Next up, I had a little play with how you can use the pencil on wet paper. So I'm just wetting a patch and putting this pencil over the top. And it does look a little bit grainy. You can see the grain of the paper here. But it's looking far more vibrant than if I just put the pencil onto dry paper. You can see it looks much brighter. The last thing I wanted to try out is adding some splashes on the paper. This is something that I always think about when I look at watercolor. It's something I really like about watercolor. And I can either use the paintbrush to flick pigment off of the end of the pencil, or I can put a reasonable amount of water on my paintbrush and just make some drips. So they seem to be the basic techniques. What I want to do now is try actually drawing something, both as a little bit of an experiment, but also as a bit of a practice. Now, if you watch any of my other videos, you'll know I talk a lot about how important paper is. And it seems to me that there's two main types of paper that are used with watercolor pencils. Generally speaking, it seems to be personal preference on which one is used. So I want to do a little test. I want to draw a very simple object twice, so on the two different types of paper. I do want to make sure it is a nice simple object though, because I'm drawing it twice. I'm just going to draw a simple pink tulip. And what I have is hot press watercolor paper on the left and cold pressed on the right. The basic difference between these papers is the hot pressed paper is quite smooth, whereas the cold pressed is much rougher. So from what I've read, the hot pressed is easier to put the pencil down, it goes down smoother. I guess it's more like the Bristol board I would usually use for colour pencils. Whereas cold pressed seems to allow you to make smoother gradients, but it looks a bit rougher when you put the pencil over the top. So I'll be interested to see how these look if I draw them at the same time and try and draw them as similar as possible, which one I end up liking more. So I'm starting off by putting down quite a prominent sketch with an HB pencil. This is more prominent than I would normally put down a sketch. but it will enable me to still see my sketch as I start building up some of the pigment. And I wanted to start here by just putting down a wash of colour. I'm kind of trying to approach this in a similar way to how I would approach a colour pencil drawing. So I want to be looking at the lightest colour I can see within the tulip and just trying to put down a kind of base of that colour. So I'm wetting the paper, I'm then taking the pigment off the end of the watercolour pencil and just putting this all over everywhere that needs to be pink. And then I wanted to use a slightly darker pink over the top of this just to very roughly mark out the shadows. I wanted to make sure I still did this while the paper was wet though, so that it all kind of blurs and blends together. And to be honest, it did bleed more than I expected it to. It looks a little bit patchy, but I figure I'll just carry on. And maybe now is a good time to learn kind of how to fix that. At the very bottom of the petals on the tulip, it's much more of a yellowy orange colour. So again, while the paper was still wet, I just wanted to add that in the hope that it would blend nicely into the pink area. And I also wanted to put down something on the stem, but I stuck with more of a kind of purpley tone because although the stem is mostly green, it has this purple undertone. Now this tulip isn't looking like the tidiest thing in the world, so I wanted to do the same thing again on the cold press paper just to see how different these papers are. So I once again started off by wetting my paper and then again did a light pink wash, added in some dark pink, made sure I added the orange section at the bottom. And actually right now I felt like it was working a lot better on the cold press paper. Everything looks smoother, softer and is blending together much nicer. I felt like on this side the watercolour pencils were doing much more of what I wanted them to do. So something I read that is important for watercolour pencils and normal watercolour is you have to let your layers completely dry in between before you go back in with more colour. So I left this for a decent amount of time and then started thinking about building up some more. So my plan here was, because I'm still building up my base layers, I didn't want to start using the pencil directly on the paper. I'm still taking the pigment off the end of the pencil. But I did want to start being a little bit more accurate with where this is going. So this time I didn't wet the paper, I just went straight in with wet paint on dry paper. And this made the paint look far more vibrant. It's a lot less of a muted colour. It also gave me a lot more control over where it was going. Putting the wet paint down on dry paper, I would actually say felt pretty much the same on the cold press and the hot press. Although I do feel like on the hot press paper, it looks both softer and more vibrant at the same time. I'm generally preferring right now how it looks on the cold pressed. Now at this point I felt like I'd built up a good base layer and I could start going in with the watercolour pencils kind of more like traditional pencils. So I particularly wanted to start trying to build up some of the texture I could see on the tulips. So there's a lot of kind of little lines on here, and I could go about this in the way that I would usually use my colour pencils. So building up flicking motions one colour over the next to build up the texture. And on the hot press paper, as you would expect, this went down very easily. And I think it looked really good until I decided to put some water on top of this to activate it. And then it ended up looking weird and kind of patchy. Whereas on this paper, putting it down, it looks very grainy. I don't feel like I have as much control. But where I'm blending it with the water here, all of a sudden it looks much nicer and much smoother. And then once that had dried, I wanted to go in one more time with some more pencils just to try and cover up some of the patchiness on the hot pressed and add a little bit more detail on the cold pressed. I didn't use any more water on the hot press though. I did add a little bit on the cold press just to smooth things out one final time. And then the last thing I wanted to do was add a couple of splashes just because I did want this to look like watercolour. These tulips are fine, they're not masterpieces, but I do feel like I have learned a lot. Looking at them side by side, they do look similar. I feel like I could get similar results with either type of paper. That being said, I did find it far easier and more fun to draw on the cold press paper, so I think that is what I'm going to stick with. So let's try and draw something harder and see if I've learned anything. So I found a nice photo of a baby that I thought would work really well with the softness of the watercolour. And all I did to start with was stick my piece of paper down onto my desk and do quite a detailed sketch with my HB pencil. And then I wanted to start off in a similar way to what I did with the tulip. So I wanted to be looking for the lightest colour in my baby's skin, so that I'd be able to just put down a wash of that colour and put something down on the paper. Now, I found in my set of pencils that I didn't have a particularly good variety of skin tones, or certainly not the skin tones that I needed for this baby. So I wanted to use my piece of paper on the right hand side to mix a couple of different colours together. And then I could wet my piece of paper and use the mixture of these colours together to put down that base. I also, while the paper was still wet, wanted to start adding in some of the darker tones as well, just to roughly start mapping things out. And once again, the pigment did go in a different direction to what I thought it was going to, but I worked out I could use a clean damp paintbrush to take some of that pigment back off. So to start with, I wanted to be using these exclusively as watercolours, and then a little bit later I could use them in more of their pencil form. Now, something that I've always liked about watercolours is how kind of messy they look. With something like colour pencil, everything's very precise. So I wanted to see if with watercolour pencils I was able to make that kind of messy watercolour look, something that was a little bit less perfect. So I purposefully put down this wash going outside of the lines. I wanted to keep things nice and crisp on the left hand side, but make everything look pretty messy on the right. And actually I found it quite nice going a little bit crazy with the colour here and not having to make everything so precise. So just getting to go a little bit crazy. Now, something that I did need to remember here was where I put down a layer and everything was looking very dark. By the time that it dried, it was looking much lighter. So I just needed to make sure that I kind of adapted for that and put things down a bit darker than I otherwise would. And I basically just put down some layers of colour, let it dry completely, and then put some more on top to try and bit by bit build up the skin tones. Because I particularly wanted this to be as smooth as possible, I didn't want to put down any pencil on the skin because I found that it kind of looks a bit grainy even after being blended when I go about it that way. Once I built up some of the skin tones, I thought it would make my life a little bit easier if I drew in some of the main features. So I just used the one colour to do this. I think I used the burnt sienna just to give me a rough idea of where everything's going to be. And I think that made it look quite a lot worse. It was at this point that I was pretty worried that this was going to turn out looking shockingly bad. But if there's one thing that I've learned, particularly from things like colour pencils, is that you can't judge what something's going to look like at the end at this point. Even when it looks terrible, you have to keep going, and it generally all comes together at the end. So I kept going, still taking the pigment off of the pencil and putting it down with the paintbrush, mostly doing this on wet paper. In some cases, I mixed up some new colours on my piece of paper on the right hand side, and I tried to add in some more purple and pink tones just to brighten the baby's face up and make it look a little bit more interesting. And I have to say, after building up quite a lot of layers, I did start really liking the skin tones of the baby. Where it's one layer on top of another, it looks nice and soft, but also kind of patchy in the way that watercolour does. I quite like the effect this was creating. When I was generally happy with my baby's skin tone, I then wanted to brighten up the baby's top a bit more. Now, it was my plan, because I wanted this to look like watercolour, to try and draw and add in a detailed baby's face, but make the top and the hair and everywhere else on the baby look a little bit more rough. So I went very roughly and very loosely with the paintbrush on the baby's top, and as you can see, the baby's hair is all over the place, just to try and create this kind of effect. And then once I'd done that, I wanted to start adding some detail in. I felt like this was gonna help bring everything together and make the baby look more realistic. And this is far more within my comfort zone. I wanted to be putting the dry pencil on the dry paper. And because this is the slightly rougher cold press paper, it wasn't as easy as it probably would have been on the hot press. But I did find that if I made sure that my pencil was nice and sharp, I could still get in a lot of the details like the eyelashes. So I basically worked around the baby's face, adding in any slight adjustments that I wanted to add. So if there was the odd area that I wanted to deepen down a little bit more, but I wasn't able to do that with the pigment without using it as a pencil, or if there was any particularly detailed areas. And once I'd done that, some of the areas where I'd put the pencil on the skin, it was looking a bit rough and I wasn't very happy with it. So I did add water to those to smooth them out, but I didn't add it in, for example, the eyes and eyelashes, where I wanted to keep them looking far more detailed. Where I used water to smooth out the skin on the neck though, that looked very rough and I probably could have done that much better. I feel like I've learned from that I need to be building up more pigment if I want it to be smoother with the paintbrush rather than using the pencil for skin areas, particularly larger skin areas like this. So the last thing I wanted to do to really add to this kind of watercolor effect was some splashes. So just like I did at the very beginning of this video, I used my paintbrush to kind of flick off the end of the pencil. I did quickly realise though that it wasn't possible to control where this was going, and so I used a piece of paper just to put over my baby's face because I didn't want to put any of these splats on there. And I particularly focused on getting some of this on the right hand side. Once I'd flicked with the pencil a reasonable amount, I found that I was also able to flick water off of the paintbrush to make some bigger splashes. I also added a couple of splashes to the left hand side as well, just to kind of even everything out, and then that was it. I am genuinely happy with my baby. It has turned out really well, way better than I expected, and it's really different to my normal style, which is cool. Let me know in the comments if you use watercolor pencils and if you have any tips. I still feel like I have a lot to learn and I'm going to practice this, see if I can improve. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a like. Don't forget to click the subscribe and the notify bell so you never miss an art tutorial. Happy drawing, guys. I'll see you in the next one.